Would you two like to start by introducing yourselves? Say a little bit about your books, and then we'll get into the questions.
Sure.
Yep.
Is it open
And
up right now?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and recording? Okay, awesome.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. My name is John Lechner, and I'm a writer and researcher, I guess independent journalist too. And I wrote a book that came out earlier this year called Death is Our Business: Russian Mercenaries in the New Era of Private Warfare.
And Candace?
Yeah, I'm Candace Rondeaux. I'm Senior Director at New America for a program called Future Frontlines. And I'm also Professor of Practice at Arizona State University. And like John, a longtime obsessive over the Wagner Group. And I've written a book called Putin Sledgehammer about the Wagner Group.
Great. And I'm Antoinette Tileva. I'm a professorial lecturer here at the American University School of International Service, and a big fan of both of these books. The books read like spy thrillers. They're really riveting. So hopefully our listeners today will pick both of them up. So I'll start first with, I believe the thesis of your the books are slightly different in the sense of, Candace, your book, I think, wants to make really the argument that the statist connection between the state and their sponsorship of the Wagner Group is something that really needs to be considered, because of its implications. And John, I think your approach is a little bit more, you're less interested in whether the connection between the state and the group. Could you respond to this? Is this a fair characterization? And discuss this a little bit. And what are the implications if there is in fact a connection between the state and these private military companies, not just Wagner but in general?
Yeah. I mean, I think I make the point in the book that there absolutely is a connection between the state and Wagner Group, and but that the level of cooperation I think tended to differ depending on how important a given area was to Russia's kind of broader national security interests, and so in Ukraine, which is clearly, of major kind of existential concern to the Kremlin more broadly. Wagner always worked hand in hand, and in Syria as well. They fit right in within kind of the larger MOD command and control. But when you get to a place like the Central African Republic, which is, the poorest, least developed country in the world, the Russian state does not have an incredible amount of interest there, and you can kind of you can recognize that because there weren't too many competing Russian institutions for Prigozhin when he was there, right? There was not these other kind of security services that provided very often a natural check to sort of his unlimited ambitions. And so what I find kind of more interesting than just like this kind of state or non-state is I think the state is already such a broad enough category that you can still see how even within sort of a very statist structure, which most PMCs work in, right? I think American PMCs very much are operating in an environment where they're um, in communication with, trying not to trip over with the US government, but there is still an incredible amount of, especially in the Russian context, an incredible amount of space for individual entrepreneurship, and freedom for kind of going out, if you're willing to stick your neck out, and taking risks as well, and trying to draw the state in to some of your projects too.
Candace?
Yeah, I would say I would agree with John's take in the sense that um, there is a lot of convergence between, entrepreneurship and the way Putin's state runs. That is qualitatively different than, let's say, the United States or, someplace in Europe that kind of operates on a less authoritarian model. In that scenario, a lot of the entrepreneurship, though, centers around both capitalizing, in a financial sense, but I think socially as well, politically, on your proximity and importance to the main mission of the Kremlin, right? That's kind of how you get your day in the sun. Whereas maybe in another environment that's more liberal, you might get your day in the sun if you excel at business, no matter what it is, right? You're kind of a good market player. But in the context of Putin's Russia, I think that one of the constraints is that the overarching and overbearing nature of the authoritarian structure does make it very difficult to distinguish, what is private and what is public, so to speak. And, I think there's shades of difference between John and I in terms of just our view on that. In writing the book, what I wanted to do was show kind of the continuity of ideas that are animating irregular warfare for Russia in general, which kind of goes way back to the Bolshevik times, but certainly got its kind of coherence from the Cold War and proxy wars during the Cold War, client relationships with countries like Libya and Syria that evolved over time, even through the post-collapse transition. But still, many of the relationships were maintained. Sometimes through personal relationships, right? And here I'm thinking of somebody like Igor Sechin, who was the head of Rosneft and a longtime KGB pal of Putin, but also somebody who had experience, in Africa and kind of understood the problem there and was quite invested in just sort of mercenary enterprises more generally. But I think, from my perspective, the importance of state responsibility. And the reason I was so keen to kind of document as much as possible and name names where possible is because one of the questions, of course, is sort of the atrocities that people associated with Wagner have left behind in some 6-7 countries, right? Not the least of which, of course, is Ukraine. And there is this large question hanging over Ukraine, especially over the degree to which war crimes and international justice might play a role in part of the settlement process, right? If you look at the history of any major conflict, you can look at sort of Bosnia, the Balkans, Colombia, even in the worst case scenarios when those conflicts drag on. There is always a question of, what happens to justice afterwards, right? And that is oftentimes a big part of the formula for finding a way to settlement. But you can only do that if you can figure out who the perpetrators are, at least have the suspects kind of, I think, mapped out. And so a lot of the work that I've done outside of the book on a research basis is trying to kind of connect with that accountability mission.
Mm-hmm. Connected to that, let's talk a little bit about what makes Wagner singular from other paramilitary companies, but also, and I'll speak a little bit to our audience about private military companies. I think I said paramilitary. I meant to say private PMCs, private military companies. So Russia, as well as many other countries, have laws actually banning mercenarism, or at least the way that it is defined. So, which is why these we use the term mercenary to refer to somebody who's employed by a PMC, but nevertheless, mercenarism as a term is not, so these companies are not mercenaries per se. And in fact, it's worthy to note that they are these companies, as the word itself connotes, they're like corporations. So they have a sort of a military operational arm. They also have a political strategic kind of arm. They also have a commercial aim as well. So, and Wagner we could make the case is singular in how Byzantine and expansive that network is that covers all three of these aims. But do you feel that in general, in the modern sense, PMCs are very similar in their aims and also in their activities to Wagner?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and uh, maybe this is another area where Candace and I differ a little bit, or maybe not. I think um, it's important also. What was I think, and maybe Candace would definitely agree on this point, is that one of the reasons. I mean, it's obviously a very macabre kind of tragic topic, but it is also obviously interesting to us. And I think one of the reasons that it is um, that the usually the world in which, and whatever term you want to use, mercenaries, contractors, whatever, the world in which they operate, it is sort of fascinating because they are sort of they operate within these networks that are sort of the underbelly, or what underpin kind of war economies, but also they operate in this sort of gray zone area between state and private entity. Um, and so and in order to understand Wagner, one had to understand the Russia's political economy. One had to understand, that the political economies of the places where they intervene, but also kind of where Wagner fits along the kind of continuum or within the trend of the overall kind of privatization of security or warfare. And so you can't necessarily take them out of that context as well, because states also respond to each other. They look at what another state is doing. How do we react to this? How do we improve upon this? Kind of in my book, because we editors like to keep things short. We kind of started uh with the end of the Cold War, where you had, especially in Africa, some of these firms like Executive Outcomes, which was a South African firm that was founded by I think it was a colonel, if I remember correctly, but Eben Barlow, and a bunch of veterans in the military of the former apartheid regime, who were essentially out of work after the fall of apartheid, and and they contracted with other African governments. They couldn't contract with the new South African state, and so they very much were kind of more of an independent, full pit entity that contracted with Angola, Sierra Leone, in the various kind of civil wars that they were engaged in. The war on terror, I think, would be kind of the next sort of era where we saw the privatization of warfare kind of go into overdrive. But for the most part, the Blackwaters of the world were contracting with their host nation. Blackwater was getting most of its revenue at that time from the U.S. government, but they were providing kind of, much more basic type things, right? Fixed site security, convoy protection, VIP security, these types of things. And they certainly shot if they were shot at, but that they were not. They didn't have a mandate to go on, offensive operations. Take that oil field. Um, Eventually, kind of inevitably, this type of phenomenon would reach a place like Russia, and where I think Wagner was unique, but becoming less unique now, is the fact that it was a much more fluid mix of public-private partnership, in that Wagner could both contract and make most of its money always from the Russian state, but they could also contract with with local governments as well, like the Central African Republic, and the level of subsidies that they would get would be very different in Ukraine compared to Central African Republic compared to Mali. But the other thing that I think kind of within that overall context, within that overall trend is it's also important to focus on Prigozhin himself as um, a guy who wasn't like I would say he had incredible. I mean, he was a street thug, gangster. Went to prison, came out, ex-con. Incredible street smarts and an incredible ability to kind of naturally see how different things could fit together and in ways that he could potentially make money out of it. And he wasn't always very good at making money, but he naturally saw within kind of the overall Kremlin environment, which Candace described, right, where you can make money and accrue social capital by kind of engaging in these patriotic initiatives on behalf of the Kremlin, by being sort of the tip of the spear. I think he really saw the how especially in Africa, his various kind of troll farms and political consulting or, disinformation, the military component and his forays into, say, like mining could all kind of fit together in a way that was synergistic. And all of those things existed prior to um, he didn't invent any of these formula or anything, but I think he uniquely saw a way to bring some of these different people together. And what we see now is, I think, with sort of a lot of the failures of kind of the new iterations of what Russia's trying to do with Africa Corps and the Sahel, is that he alone seemed to be able to he probably uh intentionally he alone was sort of the linchpin that could hold all of these things together. And now kind of without him it is sort of kind of falling apart, and no one is kind of speaking to each other in the same way.
Candace?
Yeah. So I sign on to a lot of what John has said. I think there are some shades here of difference, though, in terms of just sort of conceptualizing Wagner as a company, right? I mean, one important note is, and John will know this very well, is that there was never a Wagner Group company that was ever registered in the corporate registry of Russia, right? So it's unlike Blackwater or, its successors, Academia, et cetera. There's no sort of corporate registration out there. It was only in the months before Prigozhin marched on Moscow, in his part of his bid to kind of retake the capital that he had earned politically was to stand up this building or offices, right? The Wagner offices in St. Petersburg. And that was sort of registered. It was a re-registered company that was essentially a real estate venture that he'd started several years before that. And it wasn't even registered in his name. It was registered in the name of a Rostec employee who was kind of a straw man basically for the entire networked enterprise. So critical to keep in mind that the Wagner Group was never a company in the proper sense, nor a corporation. And there's a reason for that, right? One is because, a corporation would imply liability, right? And would locate responsibility somewhere in the world, whether it's, in the private sector or public sector. It makes it more available to scrutiny, right? The actual day-to-day, was funneled through several shell companies, some of them obviously more well-known than others, like Everpolis was one of the big vehicles. But another that was really key for hiring and managing and recruitment and distribution of pay was actually a state-sanctioned enterprise, which was a veterans organization. So, and these are technical things that maybe, in this scheme of like telling a story about the Wagner Group, maybe nobody really cares, but in the scheme of trying to kind of account for the relationship between the state and these networked entities, it's important to kind of map it out. Particularly because the veterans organizations in Russia technically are an arm of the state. They're kind of this weird quasi organizational structure that kind of came out of the 1990s as a means of backfilling for the fact that there was no sort of Veterans Affairs Department, right? And so there was no means of sort of supporting people who were coming out of Afghanistan or Chechnya. And these veterans organizations became the vehicle for that. But they also became the vehicle for recruitment of Wagner, basically, among others, right? And there's actually kind of, strangely, a lot of attention, I think, from the Kremlin to this kind of quasi-legalism. And you can see it when you look closely at kind of the corporate structures and who owns what and who is doing what within the network. And again, that just becomes important from an accountability perspective, because of course, everybody sort of, I think, immediately thought, well, there's nothing more to say about Wagner and its deeds once Prigozhin is gone. And I think to John's point, Prigozhin was unique in his capability of sort of gluing all of these talents together. He was, I think, a tremendous talent scout who really also, because perhaps of his own sort of background, he saw a possibility in people who were kind of disposable and throwaways, right, and made them into something just by dint of offering opportunities, right, to excel. He made them into something that they might not have achieved, right. I do think that that was part of his unique talent, and bringing together the linguist and understanding kind of the magic of social media marketing at a time when actually, weirdly, the Russian government really stumbled in that area. They didn't really get it. They thought perhaps, by sort of being able to monitor things like Vkontakte and Telegram, that would be sufficient to kind of, control influence. And I think what Prigozhin taught everybody was, no, you need much more than that, right? You need to kind of game the algorithms, right? And grow, whether it's through reality or through sort of astroturfing, which was a big, technique of his, to grow an audience and grow a social movement. And he clearly saw this as a social movement. I think that's another kind of important distinction. He and Dmitry Utkin, as a commander, borrowed these really big, important symbols, like the blue beret symbols of the VDV Airborne and all the kind of like trappings of Spetsnaz that were part of the sort of signaling, right, of Wagner, both offline and online, were really important for cohesion. And it revived something that Russia had lost, right, which is this sort of sense of battlefield glory and military prowess. Again, something that Putin, despite all of his many attempts, in Chechnya, in Georgia, et cetera, he repeatedly failed to do that. And I think, Gerasimov, Valery, the chief of military staff, and Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, also failed, right? And that was the big contrast, is that the state apparatus was just too bureaucratic, right? And too Soviet, frankly, to allow for that kind of like playfulness and entrepreneurial spirit. And to John's point on the latter, on the sort of the loss of Prigozhin and what it's meant for successors like Africa Corps, clearly, I mean, I think we've seen some of the reporting about complaints from mercenaries who are operating for Wagner in Mali in particular, especially after that July 2024 clash that resulted in so many Wagner deaths or Africa Corps deaths. That there were, there was a lot of complaints about the treatment of the dead afterwards, right? Lack of answers about what happened with that engagement, and which sort of signaled that actually once you put the GRU kind of in charge, the old Soviet kind of callousness kind of returns, right? And the sort of stodginess returns. And I do think that there's, even though actually the GRU has been very successful in keeping the mythos and the brand alive, it's certainly transited across, past Ukrainian and Russian borders now. Internally, in terms of just the military mission, I think it's kind of obviously starting to lose its impact.
I
Thank
think
you.
just to piggyback though off of what Candace was saying, because I think the legal aspect is important because I mean it's sort of what I tried to thread through in the book is that I think in part Prigozhin had to be so creative because he didn't have the political capital ever really himself to get the things he was doing legalized.
Mhm.
And so it was it was both it was a double-edged sword, right? He could operate in a space that allowed him to do things that other people could not do because he could get kind of a nod and a wink from the presidential administration, and that could obviously become a huge source of contention with kind of the more bureaucratic folks in the Ministry of Defense. But it also meant, a nod and a wink is not the best cover in the world if something goes wrong or if, a particular policy shifts. You're sort of kind of left being hung out to dry. And what he did better than anybody, I think, was operate in that space and know uh, how to capitalize and make money in that space. But I think a lot of that creativity came out of the fact that he just didn't have the type of capital that Shoigu had or an Igor Sechin. And time and again you saw that the creative solutions that he went out and pioneered, would ultimately be uh kind of taken over by the state. And I think he always felt that he wasn't given the sort of credit where credit was due. You could get paid out, right? But he clearly was someone who was also motivated by more than just money. He wanted to kind of transcend whatever lot he had been given in life to really reach kind of the the highest highs within Putin's system. Um, and so time and again, whether it was just, Wagner not having the legal recognition or, he always operating outside the law when it came to use of mercenaries, uh, the recruitment of convicts. He did not have the legal authority to do that. He had the nod and the wink. When the MOD took over that project, the Duma passed a law that allowed them to do so. So he always uh it was always something that he had to dance around, and what he built it could, and I won't pretend like I think he thought this from the very beginning, but ultimately, especially what Candace is talking about in terms of how he created a social movement out of Wagner, that became sort of his last card to play in the final showdown with Shoigu, Gerasimov, and the MOD, was to sort of transition from this very much, uh, you know, this person who was hell-bent his whole life on becoming part of the elite, kind of transitioning into this populist anti-elite, anti-system kind of politician in the end. I mean, he at the very end he became political. And I think that was in part because he couldn't find a way within the formal channels to get what he wanted.
I would say that that was also by design, right? I mean, from a Putin perspective, Kremlin perspective,
Oh,
you
by
know,
design, by Putin's, yeah,
absolutely.
absolutely. Yeah, 100%.
You
I
pick
think
him.
he would have preferred to have, it would have been his life would have been much easier if he had always the legal, if mercenarism was legal and he could get Wagner to be, essentially within the Russian, within Russian law, a legal entity. But he
Right.
always had those things hanging over his head.
That's right. And Putin certainly, it wouldn't have been easy for Putin, right, to legalize. And still to this day, I mean, I think actually, in some ways, the deniability having disappeared And then Putin's own confession after Prigozhin was killed, when he's sort of sitting in the office, and he's got this sort of book open with the pictures of the fiery plane crash, and he's a man with a difficult fate, right? I mean, that was really, it was a little bit kind of Godfather-esque scene,
Yeah.
but there he is saying, Putin clearly saw some sort of value in laying claim even to something that looked really on its face like a failure, right? I mean, nothing worse than creating essentially a Frankenstein paramilitary that then turns on you and in a mutiny and questions your running of what is basically, to many minds, certainly in Russia and Eastern Europe, the beginnings of World War III, right? Like, that's not a great look. And yet somehow Putin finds a way to sort of spin it all after Prigozhin sort of exited the stage and said, well, actually, we, the royal we, paid $1 billion, over the last year to run this thing. And it was our genius that sort of, was the muscle behind what as Wagner. And of course, even in that admission, right, it was still packed with lies and still kind of redolent of the kind of commitment to plausible deniability over everything. And why was that? I mean, lensing out and zooming out from the picture of sort of just Russia and Prigozhin and Putin and the personalities, the bigger war here, as far as Putin is concerned, and his inner circle, is with NATO, is with Europe. And if you look at it from that perspective, then some of the kind of more, I don't know, provincial and internecine concerns of people like Prigozhin and then his rivals like Gerasimov and Shoigu, those become a little bit more picayune, right? I mean, if you really think about it, Putin has been very intentional about, I mean, there are many moments throughout the 10 years that Wagner kind of became what it became before 2022, where the question of legalizing private military companies came up in the legislature, right, and came up in debate in military circles and was openly discussed in military journals, right? But ultimately, the decision was, no, we need to keep this gray, and we need to keep this ambiguous, and we need to keep the relationship between Prigozhin and whatever this thing is, which isn't a company, but it isn't Wagner, and isn't something, right? It is many things that it is not. And we need to keep that as ambiguous and as gray as possible. And the primary reason isn't just for the sake of it. It's because without that deniability, then you raise the risk of escalation with NATO, right? You raise the risk of clashes that are out of control. And we already see, I would wager actually and argue that actually what we're seeing with sort of Wagner being used as a talisman in the cases of sabotage operations in Europe, and then some of these other sort of probing attacks that we're seeing with drones and so forth. We're seeing now Europe changing its posture. It's slow, right? I mean, I think, I'm certain that there are people in Ukraine who would like to see it differently, would like to see it, Europe acting with a little bit more urgency. It shouldn't have taken 11 years to kind of get to this point. But there's no question that once the veil was lifted on sort of Wagner as an enterprise, that all of Europe shifted. I mean, there are national security laws that have been passed. There have been sanctions passed. And there's a very bright line that has been drawn around this irregular warfare, and that I think shows, in fact, that the strategy of deniability worked for so long, right?
I want to return to 2 points that you made, and they're widely disparate. But the first one is Prigozhin used to make the joke that he was 2 handshakes away from Putin, right? And it's referencing that he could not enter that inner circle. He could not become Gerasimov or Shoigu. He could not become sort of this part of the political elite. So my question is, and I realize you can't answer that, but I'm wondering, how does one become part of the political elite, and why was he constantly sort of on the periphery of that, despite his expediency and obviously the entry that he could garner was because of the work that he did, because he proved himself useful. But why was he never able to become a part of this echelon of sort of the inner cadre?
I mean, he never served in the security services. I mean, it's pretty simple.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not just the criminal background. I don't think people care about that so much. There are plenty of people who have criminal backgrounds. But, you know, everything about Putin's power base stems from some sort of, you know, service in the security services, right? And everybody who was close to him. There's really no exception to that rule that I can think of. At some point served within, you know, FSB or its predecessor, KGB, right, or GRU or some, you know, the Interior Ministry. And that really, I don't know if that would ever change, right? I can't think of the only outsider I can think of that doesn't have that kind of pedigree is the Orthodox oligarch, right? So Konstantin Timofeyev, right? Somebody who hadn't served, but he served in another part of the statist enterprise, which of course is the Orthodox Church. I really can't think of too many situations or people who stand out to me as those who haven't had a pedigree somewhere, and frankly, of a certain generation. I think that's also key. A lot of the people who are close to Putin are of his age, right? These are the guys of the 60s. A generation that, I don't know, maybe is akin to our boomer generation in the sense that they were very large, right? You know, demographically. And they inherited kind of a broken world once they kind of came of age, once they hit their, you know, late 20s, early 30s, when they were supposed to be sort of cresting into power. In actual fact, everything was falling apart around them. And I think that also makes a difference. And frankly, you know, there is this kind of aristocratic, I think, kind of cast to the way Putin's sort of power vertical works. And one of them is, you know, the muscle doesn't come inside, right? The muscle stays on the outside. And Prigozhin was always about the muscle.
And speaking of the muscle, I also want to revisit the point you made about the informal veterans associations and how that relates to the kind of people that did work for Wagner. I'm talking about soldiers specifically. So, and just to give a little bit of context, in your book, you mentioned how after the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1991, essentially the Kremlin cut the military almost in half. And so there was, for those soldiers that were returning, there were almost no services or nothing to help them in that transition to civilian life. So they formed these informal veterans associations or unions, however you want to refer to them. And these places became both, as you were saying, a place to recruit from for PMCs, but also just a simple, you know, just a way for people to find support after being in the military. And so my question is, John, you interview quite a few of Wagner's soldiers, I believe around 30 interviews you did. So could you tell us a little bit about what kind of people join PMCs? Obviously, many of them are former military, but if you could speak on this a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a distinction between sort of officers and kind of non-officers and then obviously kind of the makeup changed over time. And you know, all sorts of people worked for Wagner. You know, some on the political side, some, you know, just on the military side, but kind of within the military side, and especially kind of the guys who are like grunts, I would say. I mean, it's pretty much the same story usually. You know, different versions of it. And I don't think that it's entirely unique to the Russian context either. I mean, these, the folks who join PMCs, I think the vast majority of the time come out of are veterans of the militaries in which, they served first, right? That is the skill sets that you bring to bear when you're working in that type of work. You don't see school teachers, transition to a PMC usually. And like everywhere, as Candace, pointed out, it's sort of how do people come about? It's, find these things. It's often through their informal networks of the folks that they served with, right? Who join, an association, and then they find out, there's, if something goes out on WhatsApp, or, there's a poster on the wall, and then they bring a friend along. And so very often the way that, uh, so, first of all, the folks, let, like I said, who kind of are, the grunts, they tended to have served in the military. They tended to have had some sort of difficulty adjusting to civilian life, whether that was, boredom, or having, family problems, kind of slight run-ins with the law, that, they go to jail for a year for assault or some sort of domestic thing. They come out, it's tough to find a job, they the Venn diagram of kind of interests, right, is usually,
Mhm.
is similar. Like veterans, they're interested in, you know, they go to the gym, they're interested in MMA, they're interested in, there's a whole contingent that is, sort of on the white nationalist, Orthodox extremist kind of part of a sort of, you know, kind of paramilitary movements that funneled into Wagner as well. But I mean, overall, these are the guys who are kind of, they have these set of interests, they have these sets of networks. And the vast majority that I spoke with found out about Wagner through a friend who recruited them in, who basically said, "Hey, this, are you interested? This is where you show up." At the beginning, it was, you show up at Molkino, you find out what the train station is, and you go there, and then you knock on the door. I mean, over time, it became very different, much more, you know, uh, sort of kind of formalized ways of with people who actually are recruiters, and you could, especially, you can do it through Telegram channels, things along those lines. But uh on the officer side, I mean, Candace can also speak to this. I think it was then a lot of guys who had much more technical experience, guys who came out of the kind of more uh special operate, what would be the equivalent of kind of special operations, that kind of thing, who the guys who were leading and were commanders. But people could rise up through the ranks too and become commanders as well. And then obviously towards the end, uh, the vast majority of those who fought with Wagner in Ukraine were convict recruits, at the very end of it.
Yeah, I think I would just maybe shade in a few details, on the veterans organizations. They weren't actually informal. They were in fact
Oh,
they were quite formal.
Yeah.
sorry about that.
Yeah, they had a legal status, and that accorded them two important things. One is to, collect money on behalf of the organization, right, and do things, sort of as a social charitable enterprise. But that could mean all kinds of things, right? It could mean like, oh, well, maybe you need a job, for a little while, or, it can be a temporary fix essentially. So that was the informal part, was that the law said one thing about kind of the status, which is you are a social organization that is quasi-state. You answer to the state. The purpose of this organization is for the state and to take care of state needs, and so much as veterans are important. But whatever you do, is kind of your business kind of thing. the second piece is that they, right away, Boris Yeltsin, recognizing that there was no money to distribute or, additional aid to give to these organizations, gave them permission to export and import. So special license. And initially this was sort of just, alcohol and cigarettes and things that were really valuable. But, pretty quickly it also became a pretty easy way to also export weapons. And so it became a pathway for exporting weapons, sometimes legally and sometimes not legally, right? And that's really critical because that is actually the business base of Wagner, right? Is exporting goods and services that are made by the state, largely by Rostec, and a few others, that into combat zones like Syria, right, under a train and equip mission that is overseen by this larger entity called Rosport-Export, which is sort of mostly the arm that deals with sort of foreign partnerships, basically, for security assistance. So important to understand that there's quite an official, legal status. And over time, as it became, I think, increasingly clear, particularly under Putin, that these veterans organizations could do a lot of things. One, it could kind of glue together Russia's capacity for arms exports and train and equip missions and client relationships. But it could also, importantly, provide a pathway for tamping down, the rise of any kind of opposition, kind of a way to co-opt part of the right-wing opposition. And this is where I think, to John's point about sort of the white nationalist Orthodox kind of cast of a lot of, especially the early commanders and the older guys who were kind of Afghanistan or Chechen war veterans. There's a reason for that crossover, and it's largely because this was a containment strategy that was really important after the two uprisings, the first being that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then the second in 1993 that led to the challenge from the far right against Yeltsin, right? And weirdly, in the far right and far left meet in this one little vector that happens to overlap very, very strongly with a lot of the Wagner recruits.
Yeah. And this is one example of it. So Candace brought up Malafeyev. I think he's another kind of oligarch or individual sort of whose role it is to sort of suck the wind out of any organic sort of far right opposition to Putin, especially on sort of the orthodox end of the spectrum, because there are kind of very what we would call kind of like arch orthodox or far right orthodox groups that are anti-Putin, and these kind of discursively in terms of narrative or what have you, these tend to be the greatest, much more from the Kremlin's perspective, from Putin's perspective, much more threatening than sort of what we would think of as kind of Western liberal opposition, I would say, because they have the ability to tap into or kind of garner sympathy from the security services themselves.
Mhm. If we could turn now to discussing the way in which PMCs keep the political costs of war artificially low. And I'll just read a quote really quickly from Candace's book. For Putin to call for a full mobilization would have been tantamount to admitting failure, that the war was a war, not a special military operation, and that victory would not come as swiftly or cheaply as he had promised. So this is this quote. The reason why I put it is, again, it's and John, you talk about this in your book too, where you say how in 2010 there were more PMCs in Iraq and Afghanistan than actual U.S. military. And so could you all speak about this, the way in which PMCs are able to basically, because the public cares put simply, the public seemingly cares less about the loss of life of military contractors than of people who have been conscripted rather to serve. So if you could discuss this a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Although I would maybe sort of qualify things and say, post Cold War, right? At the end of the collapse, a couple of important things happened, right? We talked about sort of the cutting of the number of forces in Russia, but that was true, in the West as well, really all over the world, with the exception of places that had sort of fallen in between. So what we used to call the third world, right? That were kind of between the two poles. There we saw an explosion of, militias and private actors and paramilitaries and terrorist organizations, largely because you didn't have those poles kind of centering things on some level. So one other effect of that is it kind of stole the rationale of entering into sort of large, either proxy wars, right, that could be traced back to directly. So Vietnam is like one of the best examples, right, of where you had this polar clash happening on a territory where there were a bunch of proxies in operation. There were Chinese proxies, there were Russian proxies, there were American proxies, and so forth. Nobody wanted to see another Vietnam again, right? On either side.
Right.
And I think that's still the case, because the political cost of that, particularly for conservative movements and conservative elites, and here I'm thinking of the Republican Party, and then of course in China and Russia, it's more of the kind of the close vanguard, right, that controlled everything. They lost a lot. Every time you had mass casualties, kind of reported, and if the collapse of the Soviet Union can actually be traced directly to the ways in which Glasnost opened up the conversation and Perestroika opened up the conversation about what was happening in Afghanistan, right? And sort of the numbers of losses as contrasted with the secrecy, right? So that's really important to understand, is that no government can bear the cost of large scale casualties for unless you can requalify them and relabel them, as I think Putin has done very well. We know that something like 1 million have been killed or injured since the war began, the invasion began in 2022. But many of those, frankly, are Wagner, right? We don't know exactly how many, but we do know that there's a big number there. And we do also know that it's still, until very recently, talked about as a special military operation. So for any leader, particularly an authoritarian leader, mass casualties can be explosive, right? Because it demands an explanation that makes it very difficult to hide. But there's also, again, just coming back to the larger point, is if a war is a war, even if it's undeclared, but it looks like one, that means that the rival or the adversary has permission to also go beyond bounds as well, right? What might look like an irregular scenario or a special military operation, in actual fact, can very quickly become a conventional total war, as it has.
John?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I mean, I think again, Vietnam is a great example too, because I mean, uh, uh, you know, there you had a draft, right? And a draft, even if we let alone kind of the, in the American context, where you have a contract military, in the sense that people sign up and contract, there is, I would say, still, even though there's kind of an extremely high uh sort of intolerance for American losses, there is still sort of the sense too that is sort of a professional class of people whose job it is to go out and be in a war. And the second you bring on a draft, all of a sudden you're also bringing in sort of the inevitably the civilian population starts to have a say in how that war is being prosecuted and for how long it's being prosecuted, because now, for lack of a better phrase, have some skin in the game. They are at risk for having to go serve in Vietnam, whereas, if there was no draft, you signed up for the military, oh, you're going to Vietnam, it's sort of like what did you necessarily expect? Even though, obviously, I mean, especially in the American context, you can see, it does not take a lot of losses for Americans to question in our military to question why we are in a specific place like Niger, for example. And so, yeah, I mean, just the use of contractors absolutely helps lower those political costs because also in the American context, they don't have to be reported by the government either. It's obviously the same case in Russia. And I think, we talked a lot about sort of plausible deniability. And I think, a lot of folks, when they think of Wagner and plausible deniability, they think about it in terms of a sort of the sense on the international stage. Oh, we're not actually in Mali. We're not actually in the Central African Republic. But the other important thing, as Candace noted, is that it's also plausible deniability at home. And so, Wagner had two very different functions at the very beginning. In Ukraine and Donbass in 2014, 2015, it was about plausible deniability on the international stage. We're not actually there. These are just local separatists who are fighting in a Ukrainian civil war, right? When it came to Syria, there was nothing, covert about that intervention, right? It was an overt, military intervention, air campaign. But the issue for the Kremlin was that, like the United States, they had to figure out a way to justify kind of this foreign adventure to the public. And for the broader Russian public at that time, Syria was a far off place. Why are we sacrificing? There's some Orthodox links, sure, but like, why are we losing guys in the Middle East in a place that is far from home? And so Wagner was able to provide sort of the ground forces, a lot of the ground forces there, and lower the cost because again, as contractors, it didn't, the caskets came home quietly. And so there were, yeah.
And that's, I think one of the things that was a turning point was, I think Prigozhin genuinely believed at some point, I don't know what convinced him, right? Whether it was like Bakhmut or somewhere in there, in 2022, there was a realization that there was some indignity also being visited on his people.
Totally.
Right? And part of it was that they're not good enough to be buried, with proper honors. They're not good enough to be buried next to in the sort of hall of heroes, et cetera, which is of course a big complaint of his. And I think that's sort of, and this will probably be the last thing I say before I unfortunately have to jump, but I would say that one of the things that this conversation elucidates, I think on some level, is the real difference between sort of an authoritarian state that doesn't have a very bright line between civil and military culture, right? And then a democratic one. Both face challenges when it comes to high levels of casualties, right? Especially because also something about kind of the revolution in military affairs has convinced both our sort of military apparatus and the public that, in fact, technology will save us from death, right? That in fact you can do enough, enough drones, right? Wear enough armor, and there should be less casualties. And actually, technically speaking, that's true, right? The number of battlefield casualties that we have today versus, let's say, Verdun or anything World War I, World War II engagement, or even frankly Vietnam. It's just, it's minuscule by comparison. And that's largely because the technology and the network nature of warfare has absolutely kind of put a protective layer, right, over the enterprise of military operations in a combat zone. But that still doesn't obscure the fundamentals of a regime that is predicated on a very gray line between the civilian and the military, which I think we see in Russia, where there's really almost no bright line between the two in some ways. And in the United States, let's say as a contrast, or other NATO countries, there's a brighter line that runs primarily through the private sector. And there is genuinely a private sector, whereas in Russia, the private sector is a little bit sort of, fungible, basically. And I think that's also a really big difference.
Mhm.
Yeah. But
Great.
it's interesting, as you point out, Candace, that even in authoritarian versus democratic systems, there are still similar constraints that can face
Right.
leaders when it comes to, you know, the foreign policy tools they have available.
Right.
Mhm. Well, this was a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, John and Candace, and folks joining in. Please pick up those books, Putin's Sledgehammer and That Is Our Business. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.